Okay, hey fourth graders. I just finished chapters 1 and 2. And if you were wondering about the questions I asked at the end of chapters 1 and 2, I hope we were able to tell that Camp Green Lake is a place that you go if you've done something wrong. So, our main character, Stanley, he is going there because he did something wrong. At the end of chapter 2, it said the judge gave him a choice, and he thought, well, camp might be better than jail. And then for the other question, it asked, what happens if you see a yellow spotted lizard? Well, if you get bit by a yellow spotted lizard, then you die. So apparently they're pretty dangerous. It said you can survive a scorpion biting you, and you can survive a rattlesnake biting you normally, but yellow spotted lizards, no. So, as you might have gathered, Camp Green Lake isn't really a fun camp. It's not like summer camp. So, as we read, I want you to be thinking about why. Why is Stanley going to this camp? What did he do? And he also says that his family is cursed in this chapter. So I just want you to be thinking about why is his family cursed? What makes them think that? And a couple words that you're going to see in this chapter. One is stationary. So stationary is something that you write letters with. So Stanley is going away to camp, and his mom gives him stationery so he can write letters to her and they can stay in touch. And if I get to any other words that are kind of confusing, I'll just stop and explain them. So be thinking about why do you think Stanley's going to Camp Green Lake? And why does his family think that they're cursed? So, chapter 3. Stanley Yelnats was the only passenger on the bus, not counting the driver or the guard. The guard sat next to the driver with his seat turned around facing Stanley. A rifle lay across his lap. Stanley was sitting about 10 rows back, handcuffed to his armrest. His backpack lay on the seat next to him. It contained his toothbrush, toothpaste, and a box of stationery his mother had given him. He'd promised to write her at least once a week. He looked out the window, although there wasn't much to see, mostly fields of hay and cotton. He was on a long bus ride to nowhere. The bus wasn't air-conditioned, and the hot, heavy air was almost as stifling as the handcuffs. Stanley and his parents had tried to pretend that he was just going away to camp for a while, just like rich kids do. When Stanley was younger, he used to play with stuffed animals and pretend the animals were at camp. Camp Fun and Games, he called it. Sometimes he'd have them play soccer with a marble. Other times, they'd run an obstacle course or go bungee jumping off a table, tied to their broken rubber bands. Now Stanley tried to pretend that he was going to Camp Fun and Games. Maybe he'd make some friends, he thought. At least he'd get to swim in the lake. He didn't have any friends at home. He was overweight, and the kids at his middle school often teased him about his size. Even his teachers sometimes made cruel comments without even realizing it. On his last day of school, his math teacher, Mrs. Bell, taught ratios. As an example, she chose the heaviest kid in the class and the lightest kid in the class and had them weigh themselves. Stanley weighed 3 times as much as the other boys. Mrs. Bell wrote the ratio on the board, 3-1, unaware of how much embarrassment she caused the both of them. Stanley was arrested later that day. He looked at the guard who sat slumped in his seat and wondered if he'd fallen asleep. The guard was wearing sunglasses, so Stanley couldn't see his eyes. Stanley was not a bad kid. He was innocent of the crime for which he was convicted. So that word innocent just means that They accused him of a crime, that he did something wrong, but he was innocent, so it means he actually didn't do it. He had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was all because of his no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. He smiled. It was a family joke. Whenever anything went wrong, they always blamed Stanley's no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. Supposedly, he had a great-great-grandfather who had stolen a pig from a one-legged gypsy, and she put a curse on him and all his descendants. That means all of his kids, grandkids, great-grandkids. Stanley and his parents didn't believe in curses, of course. But whenever anything went wrong, it felt good to be able to blame someone. Things went wrong a lot. They always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He looked out the window at the vast emptiness. He watched the rise and fall of the telephone wire. In his mind, he could hear his father's gruff voice softly singing to him. If only the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the tree was a little bit softer, while the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely. He cries to the moon, if only, if only. It was a song his father used to sing to him. The melody was sweet and sad. But Stanley's favorite part was when his father would howl the word moon. The bus hit a small bump and the guard sat up, instantly alert. Stanley's father was an inventor. To be a successful inventor, you need 3 things: intelligence, perseverance, and just a little bit of luck. Stanley's father was smart and had a lot of perseverance. Once he started a project, he would work on it for years, often going days without sleep. He just never had any luck. Every time an experiment failed, Stanley could hear him cursing his dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-grandfather. Stanley's father was also named Stanley Yelnats. Stanley's father's full name was Stanley Yelnats III. Our Stanley is Stanley Yelnats IV. Everyone in his family always liked the fact that Stanley Yelnats was spelled the same frontward and backward. So they kept naming their son Stanley. Stanley was an only child and was every other Stanley Yelnats before him. All of them had something else in common. Despite their awful luck, they always remained hopeful. As Stanley's father liked to say, I learned from failure. But perhaps that was the part of the curse as well. If Stanley and his father weren't always hopeful, then it wouldn't hurt so much every time their hopes were crushed. Not every Stanley Yelnats has been a failure. Stanley's mother often pointed out, whenever Stanley or his father became so discouraged that they actually started to believe in the curse. The first Stanley Yelnats, Stanley's great-great-grandfather, had made a fortune in the stock market. He couldn't have been too unlucky. At such times, she neglected to mention the bad luck that befell the first Stanley Yelnats. He lost his entire fortune when he was moving from New York to California. His stagecoach was robbed by the outlaw Kissin Kate Barlow. If it weren't for that, Stanley's family would now be living in a mansion on a beach in California. Instead, they were crammed into a tiny apartment that smelled of burning rubber and foot odor. If only, if only. The apartment smelled the way it did because Stanley's father was trying to invent a way to recycle old sneakers. The first person who finds a use for old sneakers, he said, will be a very rich man. It was this latest project that led to Stanley's arrest. The bus ride became increasingly bumpy because the road was no longer paved. Actually, Stanley had been impressed when he first found out that his great-grandfather was robbed by Kissin Kate Barlow. True, he would have preferred living on a beach in California, but it was still kind of cool to have someone in your family be robbed by a famous outlaw. Kate Barlow didn't actually kiss Stanley's great-grandfather. That would have been really cool, but she only kissed the men she killed. Instead, she robbed him and left him stranded in the middle of the desert. He was lucky to have survived, Stanley's mother was quick to point out. The bus was slowing down. The guard grunted as he stretched his arms. "Welcome to Camp Green Lake," said the driver. Stanley looked out the dirty window. He couldn't see a lake, and hardly anything was green. So, that was chapter 3. So my questions are, what are you still wondering? Why do you think Stanley is going to Camp Green Lake if it's a camp for bad boys? Why is his family cursed? What's special about Stanley's name? And what else is special about his family? Is there anything else that makes them special? We talked a lot about Stanley's family, and I just want you to be thinking about what makes them special. All right. Well, that was the end of chapter 3. And next week we will dig into chapters 4 and maybe 5. All right. Bye, 4th graders.